Hello and welcome to Cunning Action. It's an interstitial podcast that we run when only one of us has time to record. I am your only host, Daniel, one of the hosts of Creature Club. Unfortunately, we can't meet up to record this week, so it's just me. Cunning Action is a podcast where I talk a little bit about designs I've been working on recently, how I think they help the game of D&D, and then I explain them to you so that maybe you can use them in your game. In the last two episodes, I've talked about dungeons and I've talked about random encounters. So this week I'm going to talk about something I've been using in a recent campaign I've been running that I've really enjoyed. The campaign is sort of inspired by kind of a Greek mythology, sort of a mixture of the Hyborian Age from Conan and sort of the Odyssey. It's supposed to evoke this kind of very classical feel. And one of the tropes in Greek fantasy is the notion that the heroes, the sort of main characters, which our players represent, are followed by kind of a band of soldiers or followers, these people who regard them as, worth following, but are kind of individually competent warriors. We've had a couple of different interpretations of the notion of the follower because it's a classic part of heroic fiction. Wizards released the sidekicks rule recently in UA, and those look interesting, therefore applying sort of a character class on top of an NPC to allow them to help without upstaging your hero. And of course, Matt Colville recently released the hugely successful Strongholds and Followers book. One of the major rule sets there is the notion of the follower, the kind of character who, aids your character either through combat or in other ways, because they also have skill sets and unique abilities of their own. So while I'm not necessarily trying to throw my hat into this oversaturated ring of hats, I have sort of a slightly different notion. Both of those rule sets capture the notion of the sort of, Wizards literally use the word sidekick or second, your deuterologist, your sort of the secondary protagonists of the story, the people who are just behind the protagonist and who can also be interesting and unique characters. And that's a really useful thing, a really useful mechanism in storytelling. It's a really useful way to build a narrative together with your players. But the tool I'm using is a little different because, as I say, I'm kind of representing that Grecian idea that you are being followed by a group of sort of warriors or other followers. And so rather than try to record all these followers individually, which obviously you could do, and arguably that's the most accurate way to do so in the confines of D&D, especially as a tactical game when you're battling on a grid map. But what I've done instead is I've used a rule that I'm calling a band. I'm using that rule as opposed to sort of an army or a squadron because it sort of represents the followers you have who are collectively able to do certain things. So a band is the description I've given to my players beforehand to explain to them is that it's a layer action that follows you around everywhere you go. So very simply, a band acts at initiative count 20, losing ties. It even loses ties to stronghold actions, to layer actions even. I have that recorded in the rules. So it basically activates, you could argue it's also at the top of initiative count 19, but it was a little cleaner to say that it acts at initiative count 20 because that's when everything else acts that isn't a player or an NPC. And a band's abilities are defined by its collective. So rather than being a single powerful individual with a lot of abilities, a band is defined instead by what the group is capable of. So effectively, as I say, it is similar to a layer action. And the layer actions you have are dependent on the characters you have. So I'm just going to use the band that I have written up for my players. Obviously, when this podcast comes out, there'll be a nice document alongside the podcast that you can read in your own time that'll very briefly describe the rules for bands, but they aren't very complicated. So the two things you really need to know about bands is that, as I say, they act at initiative count 20, and they are, in a very literal sense, a layer action. If you are using a grid map, which most sort of D&D games that I've seen do, but obviously there's no rule that says you have to, they do not take up any space on this grid map. They're abstracted to the point where it's assumed that at initiative count 20, your band of followers are moving around and getting into position so that when you call upon a layer action that you need, they are always in the right position to make that layer action. we do this for a bunch of reasons. The main reason is just kind of it's a lot of bureaucracy. Basically, we don't need to know where, if you have, for example, 5 normal low level guards as your band of followers, we don't need to know where they all are, because chances are if they get hit by anything, they'll go down, and if they don't get hit by anything, it doesn't matter. And in some ways, if you have these followers, you might not want them to get hit by anything, knowing that you can take the hit and they can't. So we've abstracted that notion entirely. So they don't take up a space on the board. Instead, they merely have effects that have a range based on where the characters are, because we're always assuming that your band of followers are near the player characters, which makes sense. And so they don't have a presence on the battlefield, and as a result, they don't really have health either. They do have hit dice, which we just track for the purposes of any time we feel that they might be hit, they might be caught in the periphery of an attack. For example, if a high-level spellcaster were to use Cone of Cold or something similar, magic with a very high area of effect, perhaps even a well-placed fireball, we might argue, you know what, actually that does hit someone in your band. And the main reason we track health, the main reason we're interested in tracking it, is because we use it as the basis for how powerful the band is and how much they can do. So I'm going to refer now to the band of followers that I've given my party in my campaign that I'm currently running. So that each group of members in the band has 4 stats recorded, which are the name and type. So if they have a name, or if they're just a type of follower, they would be named if they were a unique follower. Otherwise, they'd just be added to a kind of a grouping. There's the number. Obviously, we want to know how big the band is, because that's a useful mechanism for tracking a bunch of stuff, mostly how powerful the band is, maybe how resilient it is. But also it's just nice so that the players know approximately how many followers they have, and maybe even what that represents and how many people are following them because they trust them, because they believe in them. Then we have their health, which, as I say, we don't really track in terms of HP, we just track hit dice, because we just want to know approximately how tough are these things. And it's really more for the purposes of any, as I say, any large effects, or if, for example, members of the band were sent off on their own to do something, we would have an idea of how resilient they were. And then finally we have abilities. So each member of your, each type of member of your band would grant you certain abilities, and as a result, we describe them all here. So I have, at the moment, my players have 3 different members of their band. They have men-at-arms, which represent sort of just generic soldiers who have agreed to follow them into battle. They have a healer called Zezarek, and they have a spellcaster called Jackal of the Woad. So both of them are obviously, there's only one of them, they're unique, and they're really more defined by the ability they add to your layer, effectively. So this band has 5 men-at-arms and 1 of Zezarek and 1 of Jackal of the Woad, because they're both unique individuals. The men-at-arms have the following abilities. Now, like a layer, you can call on only one. At the moment, they have a total of 6 abilities from their 3 different followers, but they can only ever use 1 every round, and just like with layer actions, they can't repeat actions, which I didn't force that initially, because the layer was only men-at-arms, and the men-at-arms don't have many different types of actions, and they gain more actions as you gain equipment. So initially I said we don't need to worry about that, because all they could do, which is the first action here, is javelins. So javelins are a weapon attack with a +5 to hit, because there are 5 men-at-arms. Hits 1 target. On hit, it deals 1d6, which is a javelin, +5, again, because of the number of followers. Piercing damage. So very straightforward. You just roll as if you're making an attack roll, but the band are doing it. This is a very straightforward way to just allow the band to do a little bit of extra damage, but again, because it's sort of limited, but it is every turn and it's kind of useful, it doesn't one-up anyone else on the party, which is sort of useful. The next one is a unique one that I've given this band because the game I'm running only has 2 players and neither of them are healers. So this is sort of a conceit to allow, to make sure that no one dies, just sort of very unceremoniously and suddenly, which is to the champion, which is stabilize 1 dying friendly character. So obviously they can use this layer action. If one of them is down, the other one uses the layer action to stabilize the other person. That doesn't mean they're back up. They still have 0 hit points, but they're not dying. So they can be healed with the later action, or they can be recovered after the battle is won. Next up is torches. A band member holds a lit torch within 120 feet, so that's just literally a way to generate light, because my 2 players are both human, so they don't have dark vision, so the use of torches, especially in battles at night, is very important. And obviously I thought it made more sense for their followers to have to hold the torches rather than there. I mean, we historically in D&D have the term of a torchbearer, and so in some ways these men-at-arms can fill that role. Finally, we have longbows. Now, this is the first ability they kind of unlocked. They got the torches the first time they battled at night. I didn't bother telling them that they had the torches until nighttime came, because I didn't think it was worth the extra sort of mental load. but they always had the torches. I just told them, oh, by the way, your band members can light torches for you because that just makes sense as something they would do and saves your actions for doing things like hitting people with weapons or casting spells or whatever else. Fine. So this is the first action they unlocked. They unlocked this as part of completing a quest for another character. They got longbows. So the longbows, as opposed to the javelins, even though obviously functionally when a player uses them are quite similar, the longbows here evoke sort of a volley of fire. So the longbows do each creature within a 15-foot radius at a point of the band's choice must make a DC 12 dexterity saving throw or suffer 1d8 plus 5 piercing damage. Now again, the difficulty of the dexterity saving throw, because it's 8 plus the number of band members, so 12, that should be 13. They just got a band member back. I've forgotten to change that. Don't tell them, please. And obviously, they also suffer 1d8 plus 5 piercing damage. Again, the plus 5 is a result of the number of soldiers they have following them. So they can very directly see that, like, getting more soldiers to follow them just lets their sort of basic sort of band attacks deal more damage, which is very handy for a variety of reasons. So the first sort of character they unlocked for their band as such was Zezarek. And Zezarek has a passive ability because he's a healer, which is just that whenever the party use To the Champion, which is the ability we described before that stabilizes a dying creature, To the Champion also provides 1d4 plus 1 hit points. So obviously the idea is that rather than an untrained soldier sort of just tending to your wounds so you don't bleed out, instead this healer tends to your wounds and actually gives you a little bit of health. You stand back up, you're able to keep fighting. And that's just sort of a natural way of buffing your initial ability set without complicating it. It might be worth, if, for example, I wanted to, moving the To the Champion ability entirely to Zezarek and just give Zezarek the healer ability and take away the Men-at-Arms healer ability. But in some ways, I prefer that the Men-at-Arms are still kind of core to the band feature as such, and Zezarek as a healer is merely aiding them. That feels more appropriate, and also sort of adds the idea that if you were to lose Zezarek for whatever reason, you would still be able to stabilize. You just would lose that healing, and again, you'd get that feeling of what this character was adding to your group. And finally, we have Jackal of the Woad. So Jackal of the Woad is sort of a transmuter, spellcaster, fey character. Jackal will probably get a variety of powers over time, but I don't want to overcomplicate them, and I don't want it to be a reason for them to feel less relevant. So I just made Jackal's initial power very straightforward and kind of useful for, like, again, I'm sort of playing with that idea that they don't have healers and they maybe need a bit more health occasionally. So this ability is once per short rest per character. So each character can do this once per short rest. Stamina Surge. A friendly character spends up to a number of hit dice equal to your proficiency bonus. So this is the players call upon the band actions like an NPC calling on layer actions. So a friendly character spends a number of hit points equal to your proficiency bonus. So initially that'll be 2, it'll be 3, and then 4, and then 5. So it'll slowly scale, but mostly it'll be kind of a small enough health boost equal to your proficiency bonus and gain that many hit points plus 6. Now plus 6 is because we have 5 Men-at-Arms and 1 Jackal of the Woad, so that's 6 in total. It could be 7 with Zezarek, but I thought he already has a healing ability and I kind of want them to be distinct. It could also just be 1 because Jackal is just a individual person, but this is the kind of thing that you reflect on as you're designing. And to be honest, I don't know whether I want to have Jackal do less healing or more healing. As it stands, I like that the plus 6 means that even if you only spend 1 hit dice, you're still relatively, you're going to get a good amount of healing, especially given that it's something you can do basically for free because the layer action, the band action even happens before you take your turns, or unless you've rolled very well. And again, adding to that notion of I'm kind of providing for what my party needs, but I think you can understand how if, for example, your party had lots of healers, you wouldn't necessarily need to use those healing powers, or you could still have them, and it just means the party has more redundancy, or just that the characters they meet along the way tend to be healers, so that they gather healers. But this is the extent of the rule set as it stands. It's nice and straightforward and lightweight. I'm not really interested in making it extraordinarily complicated. I did consider the fact that if you really wanted to represent your band on the battlefield, the easiest way to do it would probably be a swarm. Merely saying that, like, whenever they lose, because swarms in 5th edition already have rules that say, if they're below half health, their ability is to deal half as much damage. So that same idea. But given that the sort of the notion behind the band is instead that, at initiative count 20, the party can call upon a minor action, sort of a layer action, but not quite as strong as a lot of the layer actions that NPCs have or monsters have. Instead, that they can just call on a little, something to help them along the way. This rule set was kind of designed both as a way of evoking the myth that I'm sort of basing some of the campaign on, but also to help with low player count. So the fact that I have 2 players, and obviously the challenge rating of a monster in the monster manual or in any other book is based on the notion that you'll have 4 players. So we don't have those. So instead, they get a band, which gives them a little more health, a little more damage. I've also given them some other buffs. So far, I feel like they seem to be doing okay. I think because it's a low player count, the big issue is going to be if they encounter larger groups. But I also think that the extra action granted by the band is really going to help with that. And that's it. That's the entire rule set. I will write this up in a slightly more formal context, and I will release it alongside the episode so that you can kind of review and decide whether you want to use it in your own time. But I really do like it. I really like it as sort of I really like the notion that sort of your characters, your players' characters like heroism, like gathers followers. And when we have these rules like the sidekicks and the follower rules provided in Strongholds and Followers that describe the idea of but you've got this heroic follower who's kind of like you. Maybe they're different, maybe they have different abilities, but functionally you're both these kind of powerful individual people. And I sort of like the fact that the band instead evokes the notion of sort of a communal effort, that maybe these people who follow you aren't incredibly powerful on their own, or maybe they are, but it's not as important. What's important is that they work together, but also that they kind of follow you and they kind of let you lead. They only really do one thing each round in combat, and that thing is based entirely on what you do. What's nice about the band at the moment is that because there's 2 players, they pass back and forth controls. Each round, one of them orders the band and the other one orders the next round. That could be something that could be part of your rule set. I think I'll mention that briefly in the document. There might be worth having a token you pass around the table that maybe just circles around during combat so that each player gets one opportunity to order the band in battle, assuming the battle lasts long enough. I think that would be a great way to make everyone feel sort of equally powerful, but also maybe responsible for the band. If you did want to make them more sort of mechanically dense, I think the biggest way to do it would be to use their health more. Maybe allow them to take damage that the party would take, or to suffer damage as a result of consequences that the party makes. So if they order them to use a certain ability, then that means maybe a monster, maybe they can trigger opportunity attacks at the cost of their own health, but that's obviously useful for the party. And maybe you decide if it goes over this amount of damage in an opportunity attack, someone dies, or you you make a constitution check for the band or something, or you don't bother. I mean, I don't think I will for the duration of my campaign, because I don't think that it's worth the extra weight in terms of bookkeeping. This is supposed to be just a very light addition to the game that lets the players kind of feel heroic in a way that at the moment I don't know if other rule sets do. So that's it. It's a shorter episode than normal, but that's okay, because I think I've told you everything you wanted to hear, or at least everything I wanted you to hear. If you think this system is interesting, we'd love to hear from you. You can go on our website, which is creatureclubpodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter, which is @creatureclubpod, or you can email us at creatureclubpodcast@gmail.com. If you think you're going to use this rule set, I'd love to hear about it. And if you think it's missing something, or you think that maybe it's too complicated, or in fact that you don't like that the band doesn't occupy a space on a tactical map, that would be I'd really like to hear sort of alternatives to that, because this is sort of, to me this feels very natural, but I'm always interested in hearing other competing schools of design. I have been Daniel, and I'm all alone, and if you've heard any wind during this podcast, I apologize. I've kept the door open behind me because it's very warm out. It's actually a lovely day. I'm going to go sit out and sunbathe now. I've been shirtless for the whole episode, and I'm just going to enjoy myself, and you should too. So yeah, have a great day, and I love you. Bye.